Tēnā koutou. Welcome to the first stakeholder information webinar for the Aotearoa New Zealand Sustainable Finance Taxonomy project, which we are referring to as the NZ Taxonomy. I'm Jo Kelly, the Chief Executive of the Centre for Sustainable Finance. And before starting, I'd like to acknowledge the earth and all its creatures on which we depend, and wish goodness to those who are working to protect and restore it. Today, we will provide information about what taxonomies are for, the people developing the New Zealand taxonomy, and the process they're taking. We'll also discuss the taxonomy's purpose, objectives, components, and governance. And finally, we'll be outlining opportunities for engagement in the development process. Please submit your questions today via the Q&A function, and depending on how many questions we get, we'll either post the answer on our website or we'll host a follow-up session. We won't be answering questions live today, but we do encourage you to submit them via the Q&A function. Nigel will speak about the consultation for the taxonomy project shortly, and we'll be at the end of the session, and we'll be inviting submissions on the consultation paper for the taxonomy, which will take place over a 4 to 6 timeframe in April 2025. So the team will give you more information about that. My job today is to introduce the Centre for Sustainable Finance. Our vision at the Centre is an equitable, inclusive financial system that enables a resilient and sustainable Aotearoa New Zealand. We understand that this relies on access to international capital, talent, and markets. And our purpose is to advance that vision by driving a financial system that's more resilient, inclusive, robust, and agile through the incorporation of environmental, social, and economic considerations into financial decisions. The Centre plays a similar role to our international counterparts, and there are organisations like ours in Europe, the UK, Australia, the ASEAN region, Canada, and a number of other jurisdictions. We think of the Centre as having 4 key roles that we play. First, as a connector to remove barriers to sustainable finance, as a collaborator with the government on the development of policy and standards, and as a catalytic convener, which really sits at the heart of our approach. If we take the view that the market will come around eventually to delivering the long-term outcomes that we need from a sustainability perspective, then the Centre takes the view that that won't happen fast enough, and we need to accelerate the pace and scale of the market response to the challenges that we face. And then finally, that 4th point, we provide some tracking and measure of accountability to progress, and that is to progress toward the 2030 Sustainable Finance Forum roadmap, which was developed in 2021 and was an early initiative of the Aotearoa Circle. In terms of how we're set up, the Centre is independently governed by senior financial sector leaders. One of the key recommendations in the roadmap was that a new organisation be established outside of the Circle, and that organisation would have independent governance that would enable it to play a role as a sort of an intermediary between the government and financial market participants and other actors, and to work as kind of an honest broker. So we are not an industry association or a membership body. Our strategy is set by our board with input from our funders, who we refer to as partners. And these partners are financial institutions and service providers, as well as philanthropies and also the New Zealand government. The taxonomy is a core part of our work because it is essentially a tool for making capital allocation decisions. It was a key recommendation from the Sustainable Finance Forum's roadmap and is widely supported across our partner group and the New Zealand financial services landscape because it is seen as a tool to reduce transaction cost and minimise friction when allocating to green and, in our case, transition activities, as well as being a safeguard against greenwashing. The Centre has partnered with the government to deliver this project, as well as a New Zealand sustainable finance strategy, and work in key transition sectors to accelerate sustainable financing solutions. We are pleased to see the government take this approach to developing policy for the financial system, with strong input from financial market participants and stakeholders. In January this year, at the invitation of the Minister for Climate Change, the Centre convened an independent technical advisory group, or ITAG, to put forward key design recommendations to the Minister on a New Zealand taxonomy. We were pleased to see then the subsequent 2+2 commitment in July, which is a commitment between the climate and finance ministers in New Zealand and Australia, which reinforced the trans-Tasman approach we had advocated for in these recommendations. That trans-Tasman approach has been the basis for the recommendations that were put forward by the ITAG. And what we mean by that is that we look first to the Australian taxonomy development approach, and we consider from there whether there is anything that needs to be adjusted for application in New Zealand. So the ITAG put forward 18 recommendations to the Minister, and he has agreed with the majority of those recommendations, making only slight amendments to 3 of them. More on that will be covered by Matteo later in the discussion. So what is a taxonomy? A taxonomy is a list of environmentally sustainable economic activities and associated eligibility criteria. In the case of the New Zealand taxonomy, this will also include transition activities, which are necessary enablers to make the transition from where we are today to sustainability in a given sector. How we define sustainability comes down to the environmental objectives the taxonomy aims to achieve, which Matteo from the Climate Bonds Initiative will cover shortly during this session. As it says on the slide here, taxonomies don't rate company performance. They don't make judgments on whether a company is good or bad. And also in the case of New Zealand, the taxonomy will initially be voluntary. That was our recommendation. Over time, if it becomes mandatory, that doesn't mean it specifies particular investments that need to be made, but it does put restrictions and requirements on investor claims about sustainable investment. So what is the why? What is the purpose of the New Zealand taxonomy? For New Zealand, you will hear more today that international interoperability is a key consideration. Interoperability means, aside from being a mouthful, it means how well it works together effectively with other taxonomies and how well it can share, integrate, and use data across various other taxonomies, systems, and standards without conflict or loss of meaning. And there was quite a lot of time put into developing this purpose statement for the New Zealand taxonomy with that in mind. This recommendation, along with the others by the ITAG, was considered through the lens of interoperability, as well as looking at how we build a low emissions future. So of particular note here with this purpose statement is the use of the words mobilise, direct, and build there in the yellow box. The taxonomy is seen as a tool for creating the future we want. It is not seen as being primarily about compliance. It was very important for all members of the ITAG that the taxonomy achieves this purpose. So it's very much outcomes focused. As well, this purpose statement also considers our natural and cultural advantages as a country and also our dependencies on nature and biodiversity in particular. And it uses language that can be relevant and applicable in other jurisdictions. So what are the benefits to New Zealand? Taxonomies provide common definitions, and that helps to reduce friction, as I said earlier, and transaction cost, because they're not developed in a black box or at an organizational level. Taxonomies give investors, banks, and regulators more confidence around greenwashing or the ability to avoid greenwashing. They're recognisable to international investors, and to be credible, taxonomies need to align with international standards and best practice. However, they also need to be able to be used locally, so they need to be relevant and developed to reflect the New Zealand economic, legal, business, and cultural context. And taxonomies also provide reporting metrics, again, helping to increase transparency and reduce cost. For New Zealand, really importantly, especially given we're starting with agriculture and forestry and we are developing criteria for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience, This taxonomy will help us tell our sustainability story to the world. That includes adaptation and resilience, but is put forward in a way that global capital can recognise and use to make decisions. One final note. A number of financial institutions around the world already have their own frameworks for internal decision-making and capital allocation decisions. So the benefit of doing a taxonomy that has support from the government and a really rigorous and transparent process is that it creates one language that everybody can use and is happening with the necessary scrutiny and rigor that you would expect from standards development. As I said earlier, the 2+2 climate finance commitments, it essentially made it a requirement of this project that we continually seek trans-Tasman alignment. That alignment happens ultimately through the taxonomy itself, but in the initial stages, it's also happening through the design process. The Centre has a very close partnership in place with the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, who are leading the Australian taxonomy, and we have a very fluid and regular transfer of information. We will be aligning and sharing through the technical work and through the Climate Bonds Initiative team, and we're constantly looking to secure alignment rather than diverge from Australia. We've also participated in a global taxonomy development group, and we have all been learning from each other with representatives from Canada, the ASEAN, as well as Australia, and the Centre also connects with the EU and the UK where it makes sense to do so. So now it's my pleasure to turn over to Matteo Bigoni, who is the Head of Taxonomy for the Climate Bonds Initiative. I just want to introduce Matteo, who will introduce CBI himself, but I'd like to say that we are so pleased to be working with the CBI team on this project. They are leading the development of taxonomies globally, and they are also doing the technical work with our colleagues in Australia. Matteo is going to overview now the technical aspects of the work, and then you'll hear from Nigel Gormley, who is the Centre's Director of Programs, who will discuss ways that you can engage. Over to you, Matteo.
Thank you very much, Jo, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matteo Bigoni. I'm Head of Taxonomies at the Climate Bonds Initiative, and I lead the team that is currently developing several taxonomies across the globe, including Australia, obviously New Zealand, Fiji, Thailand, Cambodia, and other taxonomies in the region. And our organization, the Climate Bonds Initiative, is an international non-profit organization, and we work with green bond issuers, capital market stakeholders, and investors in general to mobilize the capital and funds needed to build the type of infrastructure that we need for a 2050 net zero carbon future, aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We believe that public money alone is not sufficient to build that type of world, and so we engage with capital markets in order to finance investments that is Paris aligned, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation and resilience. We serve the market in different functions, and one of the things that I would encourage you to do is have a look at our website, and we regularly publish reports around the state of the markets of green financial markets, including country-specific or jurisdiction-specific reports, the role of central banks in green finance, and pricing in the green bond market. Those are all reports that are freely available online, so please do have a look. And in my capacity here, I lead the taxonomy team, as mentioned, and we're very pleased to be able to support the New Zealand government and the Centre for Sustainable Finance in this phase of the taxonomy development process. Next slide, please. And so today I will walk you through the main components of the New Zealand taxonomy. As Jo mentioned, we designed and wrote a recommendations report that was issued in July 2024, so early this year, where we describe the main features and characteristics of the taxonomy. But essentially, all taxonomies around the world more or less look at this specific structure here, and there are three main components included in taxonomies. One is the substantial contribution criteria, the do no significant harm criteria, and the social safeguards criteria. The taxonomy of New Zealand initially is going to focus on two environmental objectives that are climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation and resilience. Within those two sectors, or rather two objectives, we're going to focus on the agriculture and forestry sector. This is only the initial phase. It doesn't mean that the taxonomy will be limited to these two initial sectors, but this is just phase one. It could be that later on taxonomy is expanded to include other sectors and activities. And so within the agriculture and forestry sector, we will prioritize a list of economic activities that will include the three components that I just mentioned. So substantial contribution criteria, do no significant harm criteria, and social safeguards. So remember, a taxonomy, or rather the basic unit of a taxonomy is an economic activity. And so really the taxonomy seeks to list all the economic activities that can be considered green, and then to describe the technical screening criteria that make that activity green. So basically, the technical screening criteria can be thought of as filters that allow the user of the taxonomy to identify what is aligned with the economic activity, the green economic activity, through a series of numeric thresholds and conditions that allow the filtering in and filtering out of underlying project and assets. And so you can think of technical screening criteria as a way to identify investments in a specific type of green activity. The technical screening criteria are accompanied by do no significant harm criteria, which are another set of criteria that basically allow an economic activity not to cause significant harm on the other environmental objective of the taxonomy. So for instance, if I am investing in a solar farm, I would want to make sure that the taxonomy, the facility does not cause on other harm on other environmental objectives, such as water or biodiversity. So for instance, the facility should not be built in a national park, or that should use limited amount of water. Also, the minimum social safeguards is a set of criteria that spans across the taxonomy and is applied at the entity level. And really, it's a set of safeguards that allow for minimum social safeguards, such as minimum labour standards, anti-slavery legislation and regulation, to be incorporated in the taxonomy. So it's more on sort of a vision of a more holistic vision of social safeguards and social considerations into the taxonomy. The New Zealand taxonomy will also feature iwi and Maori knowledge and culture that will underpin the entirety of the taxonomy and will feature in every single component of the taxonomy. Next slide, please. The taxonomy initially will focus on two environmental objectives, as I mentioned, climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation and resilience. However, we have other four environmental objectives that will allow the taxonomy to expand with time. We have sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems, pollution prevention and control, and transition to a circular economy. So whilst initially the taxonomy will focus on the first two environmental objectives, with other subsequent phases of the design of the taxonomy, it will be expanded to cover the other four environmental objectives. Next slide, please. And so the taxonomy of New Zealand will be underpinned by 5 principles that were determined by the ITAG earlier on this year. The first principle is credibility. So the taxonomy needs to be credible in the eyes of investors and international stakeholders. Credibility is ensured by providing evidence-based criteria in the taxonomy. Usability, the taxonomy needs to be used by New Zealand stakeholders and needs to be fit for purpose for New Zealand. So it needs to be easy, its language needs to be clear and unambiguous. It also needs to be interoperable, as Joe mentioned earlier on, with particular focus on Australia, so the trans-Tasman interoperability, but also looking at international capital markets and international investors. Culture, the New Zealand taxonomy will be underpinned by the participation of iwi and Māori representatives, and will include cultural context, knowledge and technologies that are local to New Zealand in each of its components. And then finally, prioritization. There will be a list of activities that are fit for purpose for the context of New Zealand, and they make sense in terms of applicability and market usability for New Zealand. And this prioritization exercise was conducted in the early stages of the development and design of the ITAG report, and were included in the recommendations report that was issued in July. Next slide, please. And so one of the features of successful taxonomies around the world is a robust and credible governance structure. And the ITAG focused quite a lot on the thinking of what kind of governance structure to set in place for the New Zealand taxonomy. And so there are the main sort of overarching body is the Ministry for the Environment that oversees the development of the taxonomy and advises the minister on the strategic direction of the taxonomy and its use cases. So the ministry provides strategic direction, and it provides also the final recommendations on the taxonomy to the Minister of Climate Change, who receives the final version of the taxonomy and provides strategic direction in terms of the finance system and including the use and alignment of the taxonomy with Australia, which is particularly important for New Zealand. And obviously it endorses the technical definitions provided by the taxonomy. And these definitions are put together by 2 independent working groups. One is the Technical Expert Group, and the TAGs, also known as Sector-Specific Technical Advisory Groups. And these are the working bodies, the working entities that work with the Climate Bonds Initiative and the Centre for Sustainable Finance to come up with the content and the technical screening criteria, do no significant harm criteria, and the minimum social safeguards criteria of the taxonomy. The Technical Expert Group endorses and approves the technical criteria, whilst the Technical Advisory Group or Technical Advisory Groups work directly from a bottom-up approach with the Climate Bonds initiatives in order to advise of what is fit for purpose for New Zealand and to integrate the local context in global standards and best practices that can be applied for New Zealand. So the Technical Advisory Group provides support, advice and recommendations data to make sure that the criteria are fit for purpose for New Zealand, but it is the TAG that endorses and provides strategic or rather operational decisions on the content of the taxonomy itself. Once the criteria and the content of the taxonomy have been finalized, they will be sent to the lead agency, so the Ministry for the Environment, who will scrutinize that the technical screening criteria and the taxonomy followed the predetermined process. And once they will be satisfied, they will be sent to the minister. And so we have provided here a list of the members of the technical expert group and the technical advisory group. I'm not going to go through each single member today in this presentation, but please, if you're interested in exploring and understanding more the composition of both groups, we will refer you to the website of the Centre for Sustainable Finance, where you'll be able to find more information. Next slide, please. And so the taxonomy, or rather the characteristics and the features of the taxonomy, were the results or yielded from a set of recommendations that were put forward to the Ministry for the Environment in July earlier on this year. And we, the Climate Bonds Initiative and the Centre for Sustainable Finance, worked with the ITAG to come up with a set of 18 recommendations. They were sort of subdivided into 10 topics or 10 different categories. And those are available in the recommendations report that you'll be able to find online and on the website of the Centre for Sustainable Finance. We started a bit of a journey. We started with understanding the underlying principles of the taxonomy, as I mentioned earlier on. So credibility, usability, interoperability, culture, and prioritization. And then we moved on to establishing the purpose of the taxonomy, which was explained by Joe earlier on in the presentation. And we really sought to provide consensus amongst the members of the ITAG in order to come up with a purpose statement that is now the purpose statement of the New Zealand taxonomy. And we prioritized, together with the ITAG prioritized a set of objectives for the taxonomy. So the environmental objectives that I went through earlier on were prioritized specifically by the ITAG. And it's a list of environmental objectives that is very much interoperable with the vast majority of taxonomies around the world, including Australia and the European Union and the UK. And so through the lens of these environmental objectives, we also sort of set out and asked the ITAG to prioritize a list of sectors that would be fit for purpose for New Zealand and that would prioritize our work in the design of the taxonomy. And the top of the list was agriculture and forestry. And this is why the ministry recommended that the first phase of the taxonomy would focus on agriculture and forestry sector in particular. We also wanted to describe the definitions of the taxonomy, and the fabric of its coding system would be based on the NZ coding system, which is essentially an Australian and New Zealand version of the ISIC, which is the international standard for industrial classification, which is basically the basis of the coding system of most of the taxonomies around the world. And so by providing coding system that is internationally recognized, the taxonomy becomes interoperable from a structural and coding perspective. The ITAG also highlighted the usability of the taxonomy and how it should be connected to existing data and existing labeling scheme, both at the national level and available internationally. The taxonomy should also be linked to disclosure requirements, so the frameworks for reporting against the taxonomy, and that it should be fit for purpose for a range of stakeholders in New Zealand and not just be limited to capital markets. And those could be including, for instance, policymakers, but also financial institutions. The ITAG also defined the application of the taxonomy, which, as Joe mentioned earlier on, should be voluntary, at least in its initial phase, and should really contain or at least refer to a spectrum of applications. So the recognition that the taxonomy should go beyond capital markets and green bond issuances and should be really a tool for New Zealand and its society at large. It should also be aligned with definitions that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. So the idea of keeping temperatures well below the 2-degree mark, pursuing 1.5 degrees. And so the taxonomy of New Zealand should align with pathways that are aligned with 1.5 degrees. Also, eligibility. So the technical screening criteria of the taxonomy should be clear, should be numeric, and should be binary and credible. So internationally recognized for the purpose of interoperability. The technical screening criteria should be also complemented where possible and where feasible by a whitelist or whitelist. So lists of technologies that can be considered automatically eligible under the taxonomy. Mentioned earlier on, the taxonomy should also feature transition, so should include this concept of transition. The ITAG did not define what transition really means in terms of how to apply the concept of transition to the taxonomy, how it would work out in practice. But it basically defined that transition substantial, so it should mark a substantial or material movement towards aligning with 1.5 degrees. And the category should be limited in time. So transition should not last forever, but should include a sunset date. So at some point, there would be a stop to the category of transition, and transition would disappear. And transition should be limited to those economic activities that have no low carbon alternatives. So it really should be focusing on those hard to abate sectors that cannot be completely or fully decarbonized with current technologies. And the transition, with the recommendations of the ITAG, was that the transition should consider applying the system of having a traffic light system. So having 3 different categories, including green and amber for transition specifically. And then finally, the ITAG defined the concept of governance for the taxonomy and the different structure that would ensure the checks and balances for the taxonomy in order to align with a calibrated set of technical screening criteria and do no significant harm criteria. Next slide, please. And so a little bit of the work plan, and then I will leave the floor to Nigel to go a lot more in detail into this. But essentially, the Centre for Sustainable Finance established the TAG and TAG earlier on in October and November, and we have now started working with the TAG and the TAG to start defining the concepts included in the recommendations report, specifically the methodologies for the technical screening criteria, do no significant harm, and the concept of transition. And there will be a methodological paper that will be issued in March 2025. So by the end of Q1 2025, that will list and describe the methodological approach for the technical screening criteria, do no significant harm, and minimum social safeguards of the taxonomy, as well as the definition and features of transition for the taxonomy. The aim to go for public consultations in April 2025, which will probably last for a good month in order for different stakeholders to be able to look at the taxonomy, digest it and understand it, and provide feedback and comments on its usability, the content, and its applicability. And so the first public consultation round of public consultation will probably span from April to May 2025, and the idea would be to then publish the taxonomy following the review of the feedback and comments incorporated into the taxonomy. I think that this is the last slide for me. I will leave the floor to Nigel, who will talk about the work plan and opportunities for engagement. Thank you.
Thanks, Matteo. And yeah, as Matteo said, my name's Nigel Gormley. So I'm the Director of Programs at the Centre for Sustainable Finance. And I'm just going to run you through a couple of slides around how you can engage with the process. So this first slide here summarizes the key principles that underpin the approach we're taking. As you can see, they are well-established principles that are common to most successful public consultations. And our aim here is to ensure that we're both thorough and efficient. So that means reaching across the breadth of the market and being conscious also that different channels may be required to reach different stakeholder groups effectively. So for me, transparency is key, as is respect, because the reality is, I think with the ag and forestry sector, I expect we'll get a range of views across this process. So it's important that they are constructive and respectful. And crucially, we will be the same with everyone. And my expectation is that there will be views that conflict with one another. And so we are not going to be able to accommodate all views, but we will give everyone a chance to contribute, and we will listen, and we will be guided by experts. So can you jump to the next slide? Thanks. Again, there's quite a bit of detail on this slide that I'm not going to walk through in great detail, because the main point here is that there are lots of opportunities to stay connected to this work as we make our way through the process. And the best way to make sure that you don't miss anything is to sign up for the email updates through the Centre's website at sustainablefinance.nz/NZ Taxonomy. So there are a number of webinars and public consultations, and the best way to make sure that you do not miss your opportunity to review and contribute your views is to sign up for these email updates. As you can see on the timeline, the next webinar is scheduled for mid-March to present the methodological design features, and then there are 2 stakeholder information webinars during the 2 public consultations before the stakeholder information webinar on the final report in late November next year. The other point that I want to highlight is that with the public consultation beginning in April, we will be directly seeking responses from key organisations and institutions at that time. So we'll be doing our best to make sure that there are no gaps as well. So please be involved, have your say, because this work is important and we all need it to be as robust as possible.